In July of this year, Noam signed a letter on justice and open debate published in Harper's Magazine in the US. And that public letter warns against what the signatories described as an intolerance of opposing views and a vogue for public shaming. And while welcomed by some, the letter also provoked a considerable backlash from critics, with many placing it within the so-called cancel culture debate. Now, Professor Chomsky has spent much of his career defending free speech, and so it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what he's got to say about your questions on this theme and on other prevalent political issues. So, hello, Professor Chomsky. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. And before we get into the questions about free speech, I just wondered how you've been doing during the pandemic. How has it affected your life? Are you doing okay? Has your world been turned upside down, or has it been pretty much the same as always?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Sorry, I'm just wondering, has the recent pandemic completely changed your routine, or has it turned your world upside down, or has it not really affected you?
The pandemic?
Yeah, just as your life.
It's affected me by the fact that I haven't been out of the house for about 4 months. I happen to be living in a hotspot. The governor of Arizona is a Trump loyalist and opened the state up much too early, similar to what happened under Boris Johnson, and caused, of course, a huge increase in cases. So if you compare the United States with continental Europe, put Britain, United Kingdom on the side, sort of in between the US and continental Europe. But back in late March, the United States and Europe were approximately the same in number of cases, number of deaths. Populations are roughly the same, a little larger in Europe. That's end of March. Take a look at the curve since then. In European continent, it's dropped sharply. Even in Italy, which had a terrible pandemic, it's dropped very sharply. Countries are more or less opening up, have things moderately under control. The United States, it's increased. Deaths have increased. Why? Because of the malignancy in the White House. President Trump himself is responsible for killing maybe 150,000, 160,000 Americans. The death toll's approaching 200,000, but you can't honestly blame him for every death, just most of them.
No.
That's caused something. He can't let that stand in history. So he's involved in a desperate effort to find scapegoats, to cover it up. Somebody else's fault, not mine. Even though we've just discovered that he had been informed by US intelligence about how serious it was in February. Knew it perfectly well, but much more important to improve his electoral prospects by claiming that opening up the economy, hoping things sort of work before November. Kill a couple 100,000 Americans, who cares? Well, you have to cover this up. So one target was the World Health Organization. Okay, it's the fault of the World Health Organization. We'll define the World Health, we'll defund, try to undermine the WHO. And he's doing it. That has some consequences. In Africa, in Yemen, other poor countries, huge numbers of people depend on the WHO services for survival, not against COVID-19, but against all sorts of other diseases and conditions. So we'll just kill them because that'll improve my electoral prospects. And next, let's blame China. That can be pretty serious. That's leading to an increase in tensions, which could have severe global consequences. But it doesn't matter have to improve my electoral prospects. In the United States, we're now moving the next few weeks into a situation that has really never happened in the history of parliamentary democracy. Britain came close to it last year when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament. As you recall, it caused a huge, in order to ram through his version of Brexit, that caused considerable furor. Law professors, constitutional specialists said this is a major attack on the British constitutional system. Well, the Supreme Court intervened and blocked him too late. He's now saying he's going to violate international law. So that's similar, but the United States is going way beyond. The president has made it clear publicly that if he doesn't like the outcome of the election, he may refuse to leave the White House.
I saw that. I'm really interested to hear more about what you have to say about Trump, because I know how critical you've been on him of late. But I want to shift the conversation to freedom of speech just to start, given your signature to that open letter. And so I just want to ask you firstly, were you surprised by the backlash to that letter?
Very much. The letter was, to tell you the truth, the letter was sent to me. I get thousands of petitions and letters and decide whether to sign them or not. I looked at it for about 2 minutes and said, of course I'll sign this. It's completely anodyne, says almost nothing. It says we should not impose conditions that impede and undermine freedom of speech. Okay? I couldn't imagine that anybody would even bother looking at it. It's so simple and anodyne. But the backlash is very significant. The letter was of no significance. The backlash is of great significance. Shows there's a real problem. It's not just a small problem. It's a real one. Now, what's public is the public responses. What's not public is the private responses. I've gotten a stream of letters from left young academics about the difficulties they face. They're afraid to talk. They're tiptoeing on eggshells because if they say the wrong word, somebody's going to go after them. They want to stay anonymous because they don't want to face the threats and attacks. Now, that's an atmosphere that is being produced in some circles. Now, we should put this in context. The letter didn't happen to mention cancel culture, but there is such a thing as cancel culture. There's a tiny part and a huge part. The tiny part is what everyone talks about. When some right-wing speaker comes to a university and the students try to break up the meeting. That's the small part. It's bad enough, but it's the small part. Then there's a huge part, what the mainstream establishment does all the time. They cancel things all the time. All the things all the time. I could give you incident after incident from my own experience. So I'll just give you one case. There's many. Edward Herman and I worked together wrote many books together, including the one you mentioned, Manufacturing Consent. First book we wrote together was in 1971. It's called Counter-Revolutionary Violence. It was about how U.S. violence and terror called counter-revolutionary is destroying large parts of, at that point, Indochina, but other areas as well. The book was published by a small, successful publisher, 20,000 copies produced, ads going out. The publisher was owned by a major mega corporation, Warner Communications, now Time Warner. An executive in the corporation looked at the ad, didn't like it, took a look at the book, didn't like it, ordered the publisher not to release it. The publisher refused. He put the entire publisher out of business, destroying all of their books, not just ours, all their books. Is that cancel culture? Nobody cared. Civil libertarians didn't care. It wasn't state censorship. There was private censorship,
Mm.
kind that goes on all the time. And private power is free to do whatever it wants. Okay.
So that's very interesting. That links to one of the questions we received from on the theme of the recent civil disobedience from Extinction Rebellion, and we got questions from Ellie McGaharon and Elsa Heath, who ask, Extinction Rebellion protests last week disrupted the publication of newspapers, and they want to know, for you, is that disruption, is that an example of free speech, or is it, as government ministers and the press suggest, there are some elements of the press, is it a barrier to free speech? Is that preventing the publication of papers? Is that in itself a protection of free speech or impediment to it?
You're speaking of the Extinction Rebellion actions?
Yeah, last weekend they physically stopped the publication of presses.
I mean, that was a protest which didn't stop free speech. It delayed it briefly. Okay. So the question is whether delaying the press and annoying a lot of people, how does that balance against destroying the prospects for organized human life on Earth?
Mm.
We're facing a very serious problem, very serious, never arisen in human history. The decisions that people like you are going to make right now will determine whether organized human life can survive in the next, for the rest of human history. In fact, if we allow the heating of the environment to continue at the current pace, it will essentially destroy the basis for organized human life, and not in the very distant future. So the question is, and a shocking fact is that very little attention is being paid to this. Some things are being done, nowhere near enough. Countries like the United States going the opposite direction. Let's maximize the destruction. But in Britain, some things are being done, nowhere near enough. So here we have a question. We have a balance. Is it worth delaying briefly publication of newspapers in order to drive home to people's attention the fact that we have to do something very far-reaching right now if we want to save our grandchildren and those who follow? So that's the question you have to balance. I don't think it's much of a free speech issue, frankly.
Okay, that's very interesting. In terms of, speaking of balance, you mentioned cancel culture as being something far broader than perhaps the way in which it's currently being construed. Fatima Razvi asks, how do we strike a fair balance between empathy, and a just call out with a challenging of cancel culture? How do we try and balance a need to take the unique views of marginalized groups seriously whilst trying to protect free speech?
There's no algorithm for such things. There's a burden of proof. The burden of proof is on those who seek to interfere in any way with freedom of speech.
And why is that? Why is the burden of proof on the people who object to, say, race science?
Because freedom of speech is a value which we should protect. If we abandon freedom of speech, we move to totalitarianism. Free speech is the barrier against the worst things that can happen in a society. So if we don't protect it, we're in deep trouble. Now, sometimes there may be reasons not to protect it, but the burden of proof is on those who say we have to stop it. And that burden of proof can almost never be met. It's very hard to meet. And in fact, quite apart from the principle, there's also a serious question of consequences of action. So let's take, say, preventing someone from speaking on campus because I don't like their views, okay? I mean, that happens to the left all the time and nobody pays any attention. But suppose it happens to the right. Then the action is an enormous gift to the right wing. They love it, just like the Daily Mail loved what Extinction Rebellion did. They could have huge furor about these terrible radicals who are blocking freedom of speech, you know. So it's a gift. It's a gift to the far right, which they love and run with. In fact, Trump, who's of course desperate at this point, that's the whole basis for his campaign. The fact that there are fringe actions which break windows and so on, which are a gift to the far right. Okay, so you want a gift to the far right? Go ahead and do it. So there are questions of principle and there are questions of tactics and consequences. And I think they give us the same answer, namely, only under extreme circumstances should any interference with freedom of speech be tolerated.
So what would you say to the view that the recent sort of furore about cancel culture, what would you say to the worry that people who are demanding their free speech be protected are really, in fact, demanding their right to an audience? Since a lot of what's happening with cancel culture is happening online, and people are saying, well, I'm not listening to this person anymore. Isn't that a kind of democratic contestation rather than a free speech? I mean, because you're talking about totalitarianism, which has the, you know, Orwellian connotations of someone's free speech being prevented, whereas arguably in the context of the letter to Harper's, people are just saying, I don't want to listen to Steven Pinker anymore, rather than he doesn't have a free speech or platform or such.
Well, let's take a concrete, you can't discuss this in the abstract. Let's be concrete. Suppose at your university, Exeter, some far right guy comes along who says that global warming is a fraud. It's a hoax. It's invented by the Chinese, let's say, okay, to destroy us. I suppose that person's invited to campus. There are two ways to react. One way is to say, let's drive him off campus. Wrong in principle and a wonderful gift to the far right. They love it. They'll run with it. They'll publicize it. They'll move the country farther to the right. So that's one way. The other way is to say, let him come. Let's set up a counter session. Let's expose what he's doing. Let's use it as an educational opportunity to talk about the real issues. That is a sensible way to react, and it's very successful. It usually, in fact, drives the person off campus because they don't want to face it. But if it doesn't, fine. Then you have a way to reach people on the major issues. Those are the kinds of questions that come up constantly, okay? And those are the ones you have to deal with. You're not, when you move it to a high abstract level, you're not going to find general answers. When you look at the actual concrete cases, you can get answers.
Okay. So your view, so we got a question from Anna Guitart, and you've covered this a little bit already. Should we allow far-right activists or politicians to have a platform to speak at universities? And your view is it that the universities have a special obligation to promote free speech, or they're just under the same obligation as everybody else?
Universities have a special obligation. Those universities are the arena in which dissent, critical thinking and opinion ought to be not only tolerated, but encouraged. In the sciences, that's obvious. You're not going to stop somebody criticizing current quantum theory because you think he's wrong. You want to hear it. You want to hear if there's an argument, encourage it, discuss it, and so on. So in the sciences, at least now, it wasn't true hundreds of years ago, but at least today, it's pretty much recognized that we want to encourage, stimulate critical, independent thinking. And it should spread to the rest of the university as well. That's what the university thrives on. That's what the arts thrive on. That's what culture, humanities thrive on, the sciences, everything. Now, one aspect of that is you're going to hear things you don't like, okay? That comes from permitting, not only permitting, but encouraging independent, critical thinking. You're going to hear things you don't like. Okay?
But is your view, not so much things you don't like, but is your view then that kind of junk science, like physiognomy or things like race science these days, is your view that that will simply be defeated by argument in an arena that is there's a kind of discursive egalitarianism or something? Do you have that faith that harmful pseudoscience can be and will be revealed as fraudulent?
Of course, that's what you want to do. You want to reveal it as fraudulent, but you can't do that unless you hear it. Actually, to give you an illustration of what I think we ought to strive at, let me take the greatest historian of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who basically created modern Holocaust studies and is the leading scholar in the field. He was asked what he thought about people like David Irving. He said we should listen to them. Maybe they have an argument. If maybe they have something to say. Maybe they've dug something up. Of course, their general thesis is ludicrous and grotesque, but maybe there's something there we should pay attention to. It doesn't hurt us. They're not going to win the argument. Let's have it. Let's not say he's not allowed to talk and therefore provide him with a huge audience. We can ignore him, of course, that's fine. But if we want, but if the issue comes up of his, say, being invited to Exeter, yeah, sure, maybe there's something there, and maybe we can use it as an opportunity to expose the whole project of Holocaust denial, teach people. That's the right way. And we see that it works. I could give you many examples, but that's the right way to deal with it.
That's really interesting. I'd like to move on a little bit to free speech and the political arena rather than free speech at the university or as individual right. So John Puckey notes that QAnon was a fringe conspiracy theory on message boards, claiming that Trump is leading a campaign to dismantle a global network of pedophiles. And it's now reached the floor of a presidential rally with support across the world and an alarming amount of buy-in. Does the phenomenon of QAnon tell us anything interesting about free speech and potential grounds to curtail it? Does it represent a hard case?
QAnon doesn't tell us anything about free speech. It tells us something about social malaise. If you have a society where people are angry, resentful, developing contempt for institutions, for very good reasons, incidentally, for very good reasons, then you're going to get a situation where crazy things like QAnon can flourish. People are looking for something. They want an explanation for the way that they've been being treated, in this case for 40 years. We have undergone 40 years of a neoliberal assault on the population. Okay, it's had effects. Took off with Thatcher and Reagan. It's had very harmful effects on the population, predictably. It's led to sharp concentration of wealth, pretty much stagnation, often decline for most of the population. In the United States, for example, where I happen to know the statistics, 0.1%, not 1%, of the population have 20% of the wealth, twice what they had when Reagan came in. Roughly 70% of the population is pretty much living from paycheck to paycheck. Real wages, male wages for non-supervisory workers, non-management, have actually declined since Reagan, real wages. There's been growth, it's going into very few pockets. One effect is the democratic system is undermined. High concentration of power means more control of the political system. The Thatcher-Reagan idea is you throw people out into the market. No society, no organization, destroy labor unions, throw people out of the market. Somehow they'll survive, maybe, if they're lucky. It's been worse in England because of these crazed austerity policies that were pursued, which made it much worse and cost Britain enormously. But all of this has effects. The one effect is that people are angry. They should be. They're resentful. Something's happening to their lives. It's easy terrain for demagogues, for somebody to come along and say, I'll save you. It's the immigrants. It's the blacks. It's the Chinese. And it's also fertile terrain for crazed conspiracy theories. But the problem is not the conspiracy theories. It's the situation that allows them to flourish. Okay? That's what we should be looking at. Now, the way to deal with QAnon is not to try to shut it up. That's just going to help it grow. The way to deal with it is to look at the circumstances that led to its development. Okay? And those are very real. I'll talk about the United States. You can talk about Britain. But just yesterday, a major international study was released. Scientists, analysts, economists, others, of a study of 163 countries, estimating how the circumstances, the living circumstances of the population have changed over the last 10 years. 3 countries, it declined. The worst was the United States. Second was Brazil, which is duplicating the United States with a far-right dictator, near dictator. Third is Hungary, Orban's Hungary, semi-dictatorship. Those are the 3 countries where the basic living conditions, welfare, opportunities, and so on for the countries have declined. Well, in those countries, you're going to get conspiracy theories.
Okay.
Is it the problem of the conspiracy theory?
So QAnon is it's a symptom. It tells us more about, it's not worth censoring or encouraging, Twitter to delete tweets about. That's interesting. So I think that...
add one word to this.
Of course.
Those who call for censoring the crazed conspiracy theories are basically diverting attention away from the real problem, the terrain in which they develop. So they're basically taking a reactionary position. To concentrate on blocking QAnon is to take a highly reactionary position, not just because of the suppression of speech, but because of diverting attention away from the cause of these phenomena, which is basically in the neoliberal assault and the austerity programs that magnified it. That's what we should be looking at.
Okay, thanks. Brian Grady asks, was there a golden age of free speech? And if there was, what can we learn from it?
There wasn't. There's never been a golden age. In fact, it's probably freer now than it was. There are a lot of criticisms you can make of the United States. I can go on forever, but there's some good things as well. One is protection of freedom of speech. Now, right now, the United States has a probably maybe the world's highest level of protection of speech. It doesn't prevent corporate suppression. That goes on all the time. Media suppression goes on all the time. But the state can do very little to suppress freedom of speech in the United States. How long has that been? About 50 years. First Amendment says nothing about it. Read the First Amendment. It just says the state can't prevent speech. It doesn't say the state can't put you in jail if they don't like what you said. That's the First Amendment. It wasn't until the 20th century that issues of freedom of speech even reached the high courts. And the minimal protection of freedom of speech was in dissents. Brandeis and Holmes made some dissents which were not very strong. In fact, you look back at them now, they're awful. The real protection of freedom of speech in the judicial system began about 60 years ago in the context of the civil rights movement, when the Supreme Court basically struck down the principle of sovereign immunity, that you can't attack the state with words. That principle still holds in England. You can't attack the state with words. That's on the law books. It's even been used. It was struck down in the United States in 1964. Then the Supreme Court went beyond. Brandenburg v. Ohio, if you want to look it up, 1969. Court took a pretty strong position in support of freedom of speech. I think the right position. It said speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal acts, which means, say, if you and I go into a store to try to rob it and I have a gun and you say shoot, that's not protected. Okay. But that's the basic idea. But freedom of speech should be protected overwhelmingly. What is it? I think that's basic.
That somewhat optimistic view of the recent history of the US links a little bit with what I want to ask you about, going back to your work on manufacturing consent. And the Agile Rabbit team were wondering how you would update the, your famous 5 filters for today, given that the readership of newspapers has plummeted and diverse media has become more accessible online, for example, through events like this one. And I guess one of your 5 filters is, the ownership of media. And I wondered, in relation to that, what role do you think a public service broadcaster has in a democracy?
Very significant. Take a look at, actually, to answer your first question, Ed Herman died a couple of years ago, but before that, we did talk about updating. We actually did update in 2002. We changed, but we talked about it and decided there's nothing much to change, and I would still think so. But the issues, say the issue of public media, it's a very interesting issue. Notice that the United States is practically the only developed country, that doesn't have public media. There's nothing like the BBC in the United States. There's similar things like to the BBC in almost every country. Why? Because the United States, to an unusual extent, is a business-run society, much more so than other countries. There's freedom of speech in the sense that the state can't punish speech, at least in principle. I mean, I don't say it's not violated, but at least in principle, that's unusual, almost unique. On the other hand, it's a business-run society, and when issues come up over who should run the information system, the business world imposes its own autocratic rule. In the 1920s, when radio came along, there was a big struggle in the United States about whether the publicly owned airwaves should be used for educational purposes, for public debate, discussion, and so on, or whether they should be handed over to private tyrannies which is what business is, corporations, whether it should be handed over to private tyrannies to run themselves. They won. There's no public radio. Television came along in the late 40s, same battle, big struggle about it. Church groups, educational groups, universities, and many others wanted the public airwaves to be large, at least in part, under the control of the public, not just totally under the control of totalitarian institutions. They lost. It's totally totalitarian institutions. There's no public broadcasting. In fact, the tiny fringe that there is, I could tell you about it, is pretty much under corporate control. But so the United States, the world is a complicated place. There is defense of freedom of speech. There's also the power of the business world, basically totalitarian institutions, which is what they are, to take over the public domain. Okay, so that's a struggle that goes on. In fact, there are very interesting aspects of this which aren't being discussed much. Right now, you'll notice that the Republican Party is trying to just basically destroy the post office. The Democrats are not guiltless in this. They're helping. Constraints have been imposed on the post office, which make it almost unviable. They're supposed to follow a business model, which is crazy, but they're not allowed to do what businesses are allowed to do. So both Republicans are more extreme, but also the Democrats are trying to undermine the post office. Well, why? The post office provides enormous services to people, but nobody makes profit out of it. So what good is it? You don't make profit out of it, destroy it. Furthermore, the post office is a very efficient, well-functioning government institution. And that's a bad idea, especially in the neoliberal years. We have to hate government. Government is the problem, not the solution, meaning take decisions away from government, which has the flaw that it's somewhat responsive to the population, put decisions in the hands of private institutions, which are totally unaccountable to the public. That's Thatcher and Reagan and Blair and the whole neoliberal programs. That's what they mean. Now, the post office, the fact that it's an efficient, very efficient public service is a crime that has to be blocked. But there's something else that goes back to the First Amendment. There's an article in the post office is actually established by a constitutional article. The framers took it very seriously. And what was the post office in their view? It was a subsidy to newspapers and journals. They interpreted the First Amendment as giving what are called positive rights, not just negative rights. The government should support and subsidize the free and independent media. That's what the post office was doing. It was providing essentially free circulation to newspapers and media. It was about 80% of its business. Okay, that has to be destroyed.
Very interesting to hear you say that, especially given the pressure the BBC has been under in the UK for the last 10 years. Your remarks about private tyranny link quite interestingly to a question from Eric Preston that I think a lot of your readers will be curious about. And the question is, how can individuals themselves resist censorship in the workplace while keeping their jobs? So how can individuals,
That's what unions were for. One of the reasons why Thatcher and Reagan, in practically their first days in office, moved to destroy the unions, which of course you recall, one of the reasons, and have succeeded pretty well. One of the reasons is that unions are the prime way, virtually the only way, in which oppressed people subjected to workplace tyranny, which is what a workplace is, are able to organize, to defend themselves, to protect their rights, and to advance their rights. So therefore, they have to be destroyed. The population has to be subjected to unaccountable private power. That's neoliberalism, called libertarian with an interesting turn of phrase. But that's what basic idea. And how can workers defend themselves from censorship? Alone, they can't. No way. They have a union, they can. Therefore, we have to destroy unions, not just censorship, but workplace conditions and so on. In fact, we should ask ourselves a further question. Why should we tolerate the labor contract? What's a labor contract? Taking a job. Taking a job means renting yourself into servitude, saying, for most of my waking life, I'll be the equivalent of a slave. I'll be under the control of a totalitarian master, under controls well beyond what dictators dream of. Like Stalin couldn't tell the population at 3 p.m. you're allowed a 5-minute bathroom break. He couldn't do that. But that's what happens when you have a job, okay? How you live, how you work, what route you have to take from this place to that place, who you're allowed to talk to, what clothes you wear, and so on. That shouldn't be tolerated. And in fact, classical liberals didn't tolerate it. Go back to John Stuart Mill. They thought the natural way an enterprise should be run is by the association of the workers. Okay, that's classical liberalism. Modern capitalism has tried to drive that out of people's minds. But industrial workers understood this very well in the late 19th century. They had a pretty free, independent, very lively press. And they condemned the institution of industrial servitude as a fundamental attack on their human rights and their dignity. In fact, this was such a common view that it was a slogan of the Republican Party under Lincoln, that wage labor is basically no different from slavery, except that it's temporary. That was the standard view, not only of classical liberals, but it goes back as far as Greece and Rome. To be dependent on others is an attack on your fundamental rights. Well, that's something we should bear in mind as well. So it's not just censorship in the workplace. Why shouldn't the enterprises be under the control of the people who work there?
Yeah, thanks, Noam. I'm conscious that we only have 10 or so minutes left, so I'm just going to move on to a few questions on a different topic or different topics. And one of the things we're really interested in your view on is the Black Lives Matter movement and racial justice more broadly, and the sort of the intersectional turn in social justice thinking. And the question is, if George Floyd's death is found in courts to be a lesser crime than first-degree murder or even not racially motivated, what will this do to the long overdue global awakening on racial issues?
On racial issues?
Yeah.
Well, the reaction to the Floyd murder is very significant. What developed spontaneously almost, there is leadership from the Black Lives Matter movement, but what developed is the largest social movement in US history with enormous popular support, had about 2/3 support. That's far more support than Martin Luther King had at the peak of his popularity. It was a very significant, and is significant movement. Black-white solidarity, people marching together, working together, resonance all throughout the world, at serious issues being raised and developed. It's not just the caricature, get rid of the police. That's not what they're saying. And it's, but they're talking to the institutional sources of racism. It's already had an impact on policy. If it develops further, could be very important. It's the sign of a growing consciousness over the crimes of hideous crimes of slavery and repression of Afro-Americans for 400 years. That's been growing for some time. There are many signs of it. A year or two ago, the New York Times ran a very significant series of articles, had prominent articles on the 1619 series, 1619, because that's when the first slaves were brought. Actually, not quite, but the main slaves were brought in 1619. That was a revelation. It didn't teach people scholars, anything new. Yeah, we knew that, big deal, but the population didn't. It brought to public awareness lots of things which were hidden in the background. That was a reflection of major changes that had taken place in large parts of the society. Not all, by any means. One thing that's happening is that the forces of white supremacy are also solidifying. So you're getting and it's not just race, it's class, gender, other things. So you're getting a sharp break. The Republican Party, which drifted way off the spectrum years ago, they're hardly a parliamentary party anymore. They have been moving towards trying to save themselves as a political organization by being the party of white supremacy, racism, misogyny, ultranationalism, guns, and so on. That's about all they can do. When you're totally dedicated to service to wealth and power, you can't get a voting base unless you put together other issues. And that's what they're doing. It's a long story. We don't have time for it. But it's basically it's a minority party. They know it perfectly well. Can't win a fair election. So the only things they can do is try to sustain themselves by putting together what are called these so-called cultural issues, things like white supremacy. And you see it very clearly. Trump is kind of turns all this into a caricature. He's a clever politician. He knows how to do it. But he's putting together all of these malicious streaks in the society and coalescing them and exaggerating. If he's not defeated in the election, we're going to be in serious trouble. And if the US is in serious trouble, so is the world. And furthermore, he has already made it explicit that if he doesn't like the outcome of the election, he may not leave office. Now, that's a pretty serious blow to parliamentary democracy.
Yeah, I noticed that your view on Trump seemed to shift a little bit. Like when the election first took place in 2016, you were obviously, very worried about him. But I think you had been such a consistent critic of Obama's foreign policy, and you mentioned Trump's unpredictability. There was not. I feel as if now you've come to the view that this is the most important election that America perhaps has ever seen, and Trump is a huge danger to humanity. At what point in the last 4 years did you reach that strong view, such that you now think that the US should vote for Joe Biden and get behind that cause? Was it a long journey for you? Did it happen as soon as Trump took office and immediately started with the executive orders, or?
Well, the last 4 years, there was plenty to worry about in 2016, but it was prospects. Now there's much more to worry about because we've seen it. Okay, what's happened for the last 4 years? Well, let's start by taking a look at the famous doomsday clock set every January. Serious people, scientists, others, trying to estimate the security situation of the world. Started in 1947 after the atom bomb. Every year Trump has been in office, the minute hand has been moved towards midnight, closer to midnight. 2 years ago, midnight means termination for everybody. 2 years ago, it reached the closest point it had reached ever since in 75 years. This last January, the analysts gave up minutes, moved to seconds. It's now 100 seconds to midnight. That's Trump. What's happened since January? Trump has advanced it along every single dimension. The analysts listed three major issues: global warming, nuclear war, destruction of democracy, which does belong there because it's only a vibrant, functioning democracy of engaged people that can deal with the other two. So there's three. What has Trump done? Moved further to dismantle the last remnants of the arms control regime, which has offered some protection against total destruction. Moved to develop highly destructive, very threatening new weapons, which of course just encourages others to do the same, moving us towards disaster. That's the first thing. Global warming, totally committed to maximizing the use of fossil fuels. A couple of weeks ago, just opened up the last nature reserve in the country to drilling, huge nature reserve, cut back on regulations which somewhat mitigate the disaster. Now that's Trump. The one leader in the world outside of characters like Bolsonaro, who in Brazil, who is moving to drive the world towards destruction through global warming society. On deterioration of democracy, it's a joke. The executive branch of government has been totally cleansed of any dissident voice. There's nothing but sycophants. Congress, under his Mitch McConnell, his associate, used to be a deliberative body. Doesn't look at legislation. It does nothing but tax cuts for the rich and trying to stack the judiciary with young, far-right justices who'll make sure that nothing will happen for a generation. There are inspectors general who are supposed to oversee executive offices for malfeasance, inefficiency, and so on. They started looking into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington, the enormous corruption. He took care of that. He fired them. That's since January. Okay, so a couple more years, and now, as I said, he's saying, "I may not leave office if I don't like it." Okay,
it's quite
being considered very seriously in high places.
It's quite a catalogue of things to lament there, Noam. We're almost out of time. I've got two questions left, if you wouldn't mind, if you've got the time to spare for just two more very quick ones. The first one from Kelly Vipond, I think relates to what you just said, insofar as she writes, I love this quote of yours. Optimism is a strategy for making a better future. Do you believe, given what you just said about all the things Trump has done and is trying to do, do you still believe this is true?
Yes, there are many reasons for optimism. Groups like Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, the climate change movement, Sunrise Movement, the massive demonstrations in the streets. In a couple of days, 6 days, there's going to be the first meeting of the Progressive International movement based on the Sanders movement in the United States, the M25 in Europe, Varoufakis's M25. It's a transnational movement that's trying to preserve what makes sense in the European Union and get rid of what's harmful, which there's a lot. Okay, they have a lot of voices from the global South, trying to be a real international. The meeting will take place in Iceland, where the Prime Minister is a member. All right, here's an opportunity to develop a counterforce, international counterforce to the right-wing tendencies that have been exaggerated by the neoliberal assault and the demagogues who've come out of it. Here's a possibility. There's two forces coalescing in the world. Like there's a reactionary international being led in Washington. There's a progressive international being formed. It's kind of symbolic of a struggle that's taking place all over the world. Can you be optimistic? Yeah, why not?
Great.
Plenty of opportunities. Terrible problems, but lots of opportunities.
That is wonderful to hear. And one very final question from Roberto Cantoni, who asks, apart from your own huge canon, which philosopher's book would you most like to have written?
Would I most like to have written?
Yeah.
Probably, I don't know, Hume's treatise. In fact, if I could go back in time, my ideal would be to find myself in Edinburgh in the mid-18th century, stopping by a coffee shop to have a cup of coffee with David Hume and his friend Adam Smith.
What an excellent choice. Noam, it has been such an incredible, inspiring pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I can't wait to read your new book out later this month. So have a great day in Arizona, and thank you again.
Thank you very much.